Substitute will be considered as original text for the purposes of further amendment. I now recognize myself for an opening statement on the bill and the amendment for 5 minutes. So I support H.R. 5172, the District of Columbia Criminal Mandatory Minimums Reform Act. In 2023, the D.C. Council passed the revised Criminal Code Act of 2022. It implemented progressive soft-on-crime sentencing reforms and lowered minimum sentences for many crimes. Congress successfully passed H.J. Res. 26 to disapprove of this radical legislation. H.J. Res. 26 was a bipartisan effort signed into law by then-President Biden as Public Law 118-1. Even with this success, the D.C. Code still contains mandatory minimums that are much lower than the rest of the nation. For instance, currently, second-degree murder and rape have no mandatory minimum sentence. First-degree burglary has only a 5-year mandatory minimum. First-degree child sexual abuse has no mandatory minimum. This legislation updates mandatory minimums for a few violent crimes. This bill ensures that several offenses, including first and second-degree murder, rape, first-degree sexual assault of a child, armed and unarmed carjacking, and first-degree burglary are taken seriously in D.C. courts by reconfiguring the mandatory sentences. These reforms are necessary to address violent crime in the district. And what do greater sentences do? They provide both specific and general deterrence. What is the purpose of a judicial system, a criminal justice system? It is to protect people from those who commit violent crime in particular, but those who commit crimes. And when you sentence someone, you have both a specific deterrence, that is to say, that individual is removed from the community upon conviction for the crime that they have committed. Number two, you also get general deterrence because when the law is enforced, oddly enough, other people say, I don't want that to happen to me, thus I don't want to engage in this criminal conduct. And so you see specific and general deterrence. Third thing that you see is an opportunity for the community itself to find restitution, retribution, and honor the rule of law, which is necessary in a constitutional republic that honors freedom. And then also you do allow victims to recover through these types of sentences that are necessary. So I also want to give you 7 attacks that happened here in this particular location, meaning District of Columbia. We had on August 3rd of this year, Doge staffer beaten by teens in attempted carjacking. In June 30th, end of June, we had a congressional intern shot dead. On May 21st, we had 2 Israeli embassy staffers shot and killed. On May 17th, we had a mob of about 100 teenagers wreak havoc in the Navy Yard neighborhood, just a block from Nats Park. On May 9th, he had a senior congressional staffer carjacked and robbed in the Navy Yard. In late 2023, House Democrat Henry Cuellar was carjacked by armed, masked men outside an apartment building in the Navy Yard. He condemned the crime, calling the criminals punks with guns, and touched on soft-on-crime policies, noting that if criminals are put in jail, you've got to lock them up and keep them there. That's what mandatory minimums do. Then another House Democrat was assaulted in an apartment elevator in February of 2023. Again, this article, 19-year-old former Doge worker assaulted in D.C. carjacking attempt. Senator Rand Paul's staffer attacked in Washington, D.C. An FBI special agent was carjacked in Washington, D.C. A Safeway employee in D.C. was slashed with an axe by a shoplifter. Normally, you think of shoplifting as a misdemeanor. In Arizona, it's a Class 1 misdemeanor. But here, greater violence. How about this? 2 separate armed assaults in Northwest D.C. stopped by a Good Samaritan minutes apart. August of this year, armed thug terrorizes Peace Street in D.C. stick-up. And then, this one's old, but it's 23, it's an oldie, but a sad one. Congressional staffer attacked near Nats Park following charity baseball game. The point is, those of us who have prosecuted and defended, we understand something. When someone is facing mandatory minimums, they tend to have that general deterrence effect. They want to stay out of prison. They want to stop, and that's what this would do. And these sentences proposed in this bill are not out of whack or out of line with the vast majority of jurisdictions in this country, but to have no mandatory minimum for rape or no mandatory minimum for first-degree child abuse, that is out of whack with America. And so I encourage people to support my bill, and now I yield back and recognize the ranking member for his opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just again, I want to oppose this bill. This is a new aggressive mandatory sentencing act for the district. And I just want to remind us that we should be following the will of DC residents, and that the existing research on mandatory minimum sentencing is important for us as this bill is debated. Now, decades of evidence shows that mandatory minimum sentencing laws have actually failed to reduce crime, and in many ways have worsened the problems within our judicial system and justice system. Now, one of the clearest outcomes of mandatory minimum sentencing has been the exponential increase of the U.S. prison population. The result of this type of legislation from the 90s was mass incarceration, not meaningful or lasting reductions in crime. Now, research has shown that there's no evidence that mandatory minimums actually significantly reduce crime rates. Now, research instead points to the conclusion that it is certainly that it is the certainty of punishment, not the severity, that actually deters crime. Communities are asking for more detectives, more effective prosecutions, more police patrols, not longer sentences alone. Now, over the last 2 decades, both the federal government and the states have begun to move away from mandatory minimum sentencing. This has been a bipartisan push. In fact, Republicans who have championed this issue have included Senators Ted Cruz, Mike Lee, John Cornyn, and many others. Now, beyond its limited crime control impact, increasing mandatory minimum sentencing makes our legal system less effective. Judges lose discretion to consider mitigating circumstances or to propose alternative punishments. Mandatory minimum sentencing also disproportionately affects minority groups. So this is also a racial justice issue. At the federal level, mandatory minimum sentencing is rarely applied to most violent crimes. So we must learn from our past mistakes. Mandatory minimum sentencing has fueled mass incarceration, failed to deter crime, and denied and deepened racial disparities. So we have the evidence in front of us. We can do better, and I urge my colleagues to allow DC to control its own laws and to vote no, and I yield back.
Who seeks recognition? Chair recognizes Delegate Norton from District of Columbia.
This undemocratic and paternalistic bill, which amends DC law to apply mandatory minimums to certain crimes and to increase existing mandatory minimums for certain crimes. The over 700,000 DC residents, the majority of whom are Black and brown, are capable and worthy of governing themselves. I ask unanimous consent to enter into the record letters opposing this bill from DC Mayor Muriel Bowser, the entire DC Council, and the DC Attorney General Brian Schwab.
Without objection.
I strongly oppose mandatory minimums for several reasons, including that they do not deter crime and for their role in this country's mass incarceration crisis. However, whether to establish, eliminate, increase, or decrease mandatory minimums should be a decision for DC alone. I respect DC home rule. I want to discuss democracy or lack thereof on DC. The DC Council has 13 members. Its residents do not if residents do not like how the members vote, residents can vote them out of office or pass a ballot measure. That is called democracy. Congress has 535 voting members. None are elected by DC residents. If DC residents do not like how the members vote on local DC matters, residents cannot vote them out of office or pass a ballot measure. That is the antithesis of democracy. To my Republican colleagues, I want to share with you the first two paragraphs of the signing statement your fellow Republican, President Richard Nixon, issued on the DC Home Rule Act. Quote, as a longtime supporter of self-government for the District of Columbia, I am pleased to sign into law a measure which is of historic significance for the citizens of the nation's capital. I first voted for Home Rule as a member of the House of Representatives in 1948, and I have endorsed the enactment of Home Rule legislation during both my terms as president. One of the major goals of this administration is to place responsibility for local functions under local control and to provide local governments with the authority and resources they need to serve their communities effectively. The measure I signed today represents a significant step in achieving this goal in the city of Washington. I will give the people of the District of Columbia the right to elect their own city officials to govern themselves in local affairs. As the nation approaches the 200th anniversary of its founding, it is particularly appropriate to assure these persons who live in our capital city rights and privileges which have long been enjoyed by most of their countrymen, close quote. I urge note on this bill, and I yield back.
General Lady yields back. Who else wishes to be heard on this bill? Seeing none, the question before you now is the amendment of the nature of a substitute. All those in favor signify by voting aye. Aye. Opposed, no? No. Opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to.